Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story is of Joseph Campbell, a seeker of shadows, who dared to map the hidden continents of the mind. Relax as we explore the life and work of Joseph Campbell, a wanderer through the world's sacred stories, a translator of ancient wisdom into modern language, a cartographer of the soul's journey, who explored the mind, discovering the universal patterns that unite all human stories, uncovering the mythic dimensions that live beneath the surface of ordinary life, revealing how the hero's quest mirrors our own psychological transformation. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychology and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the landscape of the soul. Tell me in the comments what draws you most: the mystery of dreams, the spark of emotion, the intangibility of spirit, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the life and work of Joseph Campbell as we wander the corridors of the unconscious and listen to the whispering mind beneath the mind. In the early spring of 1904, in the bustling town of White Plains, New York, a child was born who would one day teach the world to read the language of myth. Joseph John Campbell entered a world still touched by the Victorian age, yet trembling on the edge of modernity. His father, Charles William Campbell, was a wholesale hosiery importer, a man of business and practicality, grounded in the material concerns of providing for his family. His mother, Josephine Lynch Campbell, carried within her the spiritual fervor of her Irish Catholic heritage, a faith that colored the household with ritual, story, and the sense that beyond the visible world lay mysteries both terrible and beautiful. Joseph was the eldest child, born into a family that would soon expand to include his younger brother Charlie. The Campbell home was comfortable, middle class, shaped by the values of hard work and education that characterized many Irish-American families of that era. But from his earliest years, young Joseph displayed a quality that set him apart from the ordinary concerns of childhood. He possessed an insatiable curiosity, a hunger for stories, and a peculiar ability to see connections where others saw only separate things. Where other children might play with toys as mere objects, Joseph imbued them with narrative, with meaning, with a sense that even the smallest thing participated in a larger story. The first great awakening of Joseph Campbell's mythological consciousness came not from books, but from an experience that would mark him forever. When he was 7 years old, his father took him and his brother to see Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. The spectacle dazzled the young boy, the horses, the demonstrations of frontier life, the theatrical recreation of vanishing America. But what truly captured Joseph's imagination were the Native Americans who performed in the show. Something in their presence, in the dignity and mystery they carried, reached deep into the child's soul and planted a seed that would flower throughout his life. From that moment forward, Joseph became obsessed with Native American culture. He devoured every book he could find on the subject. He visited the American Museum of Natural History in New York City so frequently that he came to know its halls as intimately as his own home. He would stand before the totem poles and masks, the ceremonial objects and sacred artifacts, and feel himself transported into a world where the boundary between human and divine, between matter and spirit, seemed permeable and alive. In those quiet museum galleries, surrounded by the material remnants of living traditions, Joseph began to sense something that would become the foundation of his life's work: the idea that beneath the prose, surface diversity of human cultures lay patterns, themes, and images that repeated themselves across time and space, as if humanity were telling itself the same essential story in countless variations. His education proceeded along conventional lines, but always with this undercurrent of mythological fascination. He attended the Iona School, a Catholic preparatory school in New Rochelle, where he received a rigorous classical education. The teachings of the Church, with its rich symbolic language, its narratives of sin and redemption, its architectural grandeur and ritual precision, gave him his first structured encounter with myth as a living force. He learned the stories of the saints, the parables of Christ, the epic sweep of biblical history. Yet even then, with the innocence and audacity of youth, he began to wonder, were these stories true in the way his teachers claimed, or were they true in some other, perhaps deeper way? Were they history, or were they something else? Something that spoke to the soul rather than to the empirical mind? At Canterbury School in Connecticut, where he continued his education, Joseph excelled in languages and literature. He was particularly drawn to the ancient world, to Latin and Greek, to the myths of gods and heroes that seemed so alive, so psychologically real despite their fantastical elements. He read Homer and Virgil, and found in their verses a vitality that the modern world seemed to lack. The gods of Olympus, the journey of Odysseus, the descent of Aeneas into the underworld. These were not quaint fairy tales, but maps of human experience rendered in symbolic language. In 1921, Joseph Campbell entered Dartmouth College, but he stayed for only half a year before transferring to Columbia University in New York City. Columbia would become the intellectual home that shaped his mature thinking. Here, in the vibrant academic atmosphere of the 1920 seconds, Campbell encountered the rigorous study of literature, comparative mythology, and medieval studies that would form the foundation of his scholarly method. He studied under some of the finest minds of his generation, absorbing methodologies from multiple disciplines and beginning to develop the synthetic, cross-cultural approach that would characterize his later work. During his undergraduate years, Campbell demonstrated a remarkable capacity for intellectual synthesis. He majored in English literature and minored in classics, all while maintaining his passionate interest in Native American studies. His thesis, written in his senior year, examined the Grail legend in Arthurian romance, a topic that would remain central to his thinking throughout his life. In these medieval stories of quest and transformation, Campbell found themes that resonated with the Native American myths he had studied as a child, with the classical myths of Greece and Rome, and with the Christian narratives of his upbringing. The pattern was beginning to emerge. The hero who leaves home, faces trials, obtains something precious, and returns transformed. Upon graduating from Columbia in 1925, Campbell received a fellowship to continue his studies in Europe. This journey abroad would prove transformative. He spent time in Paris, that glittering capital of modernist art and literature, where expatriate writers and artists were reinventing the possibilities of human expression. He traveled to Munich, where he studied Old French, and Provençal at the University of Munich, diving deeper into the medieval romances and the troubadour tradition. But perhaps most significantly, this European sojourn exposed him to a wider world of intellectual currents that would profoundly shape his thinking. In Europe, Campbell discovered two thinkers who would become as important to him as any personal mentor: Carl Gustav Jung and James Joyce. He acquired a copy of Jung's recently published work and found himself stunned by the Swiss psychiatrist's ideas about the collective unconscious and archetypes. Here was a scientific vocabulary, a psychological framework for understanding what Campbell had been sensing all along. That myths were not merely quaint stories from primitive peoples, but expressions of fundamental structures in the human psyche. Jung proposed that beneath our individual consciousness lay deeper layers of mind shared by all humanity, populated by universal images and patterns that manifested in dreams, myths, art, and religion across all cultures. This was revolutionary. It meant that the hero, the wise old man, the great mother, the trickster, these were not arbitrary inventions, but reflections of something real in the architecture of the human soul. Joyce's impact was equally profound, but of a different character. In Joyce's sprawling experimental novels, particularly Ulysses, and the work in progress that would become Finnegan's Wake, Campbell found a modern mythology in the making. Joyce was doing something audacious. He was taking the ancient myths and weaving them into the texture of contemporary life, showing that the mythic patterns still operated in the mundane world of early 20th century Dublin. Leopold Bloom's wanderings through the city paralleled Odysseus's journey home. The language itself became mythological, thick with allusion, pun, and symbolic density. Campbell saw in Joyce a model for how one might be both utterly modern and deeply mythological, how one might honor the ancient wisdom while speaking in a contemporary voice. Campbell returned to Columbia in 1929 to begin doctoral studies in medieval literature, but the timing could hardly have been worse. The stock market crash of 1929 plunged America into the Great Depression. Academic positions became scarce. Campbell found himself in an increasingly precarious situation, pursuing advanced studies in an era of economic catastrophe with dim prospects for employment. The financial strain, combined with growing conflicts with his doctoral committee about the direction of his research, led Campbell to make a decision that would have seemed catastrophic to his peers. He withdrew from the doctoral program, leaving without a PhD. What followed was a period that Campbell himself would later describe as essential to his development, though it was marked by uncertainty and struggle. Unable to find stable academic employment, Campbell retreated to a small cabin in Woodstock, New York. For nearly 5 years, from 1929 to 1934, he lived in relative isolation, reading voraciously and thinking deeply about the patterns he had been discovering in world mythology. He survived on modest support from his family and the occasional odd job, but mainly he read. 8 to 9 hours a day, he later recalled. He read Sanskrit texts and medieval manuscripts, anthropological studies and psychoanalytic theory, philosophy and comparative religion. He read Jung and Freud, Spengler and Nietzsche, the Upanishads, and the Arthurian cycles. This period of withdrawal, which might have broken a less determined person, became Campbell's version of the very mythological pattern he was studying. He had left the ordinary world of conventional academic success and entered a wilderness of uncertainty. In that wilderness, away from the demands of institutions and career, he underwent a transformation. He was living the hero's journey himself, the call to adventure that takes one away from the known world. The ordeal of isolation and doubt, the gradual acquisition of knowledge and insight that would become his boon to bring back to society. In 1934, Campbell's period of isolation ended when he received an offer to teach at Sarah Lawrence College, a progressive women's college in Bronxville, New York. This position would become his professional home for the next 38 years, until his retirement in 1972. Sarah Lawrence was an unusual institution, committed to individualized education, to fostering creativity and independent thinking. It was the perfect environment for Campbell's synthesizing, interdisciplinary approach. He taught literature, but his courses ranged widely across mythology, comparative religion, and the arts. His students recalled him as a dynamic, passionate teacher who could make ancient myths feel urgently relevant to modern life. It was at Sarah Lawrence that Campbell began to formulate the ideas that would culminate in his masterwork. Throughout the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds, he continued his comparative study of world mythology, now with the added perspective of teaching and dialogue with students. He became friends with other scholars who shared his interests, particularly those associated with the Eranos conferences in Switzerland. Annual gatherings where Jungian analysts, comparative religion scholars, and other thinkers explored the symbolic dimensions of human culture. Through these connections, Campbell deepened his understanding of Jungian psychology and its applications to mythology. In 1938, Campbell married Jean Erdman, a dancer and choreographer who was a student at Sarah Lawrence. Jean was herself a remarkable figure, a pioneer of modern dance who had studied with Martha Graham. Their marriage would be a true partnership of creative minds. Jean's work in dance, which often drew on mythological themes, complemented Joseph's scholarly pursuits. They supported each other's work, and their relationship provided Campbell with emotional stability and intellectual companionship that enriched his thinking. During World War II, Campbell served as an editor for various scholarly projects, including the ambitious plan to translate and publish the collected works of the medieval German scholar Heinrich Zimmer, who had fled Nazi Germany and died prematurely in 1943. This editorial work plunged Campbell deeply into Indian mythology and philosophy, expanding his already wide-ranging knowledge base. The war years were productive, despite the global lifelinks. Turmoil. Campbell worked steadily on his manuscript, refining his ideas, testing them against an ever-expanding range of mythological material from around the world. Finally, in 1949, after years of gestation, The Hero with 1,000 Faces was published. Campbell was 45 years old. The book represented the culmination of his decades of reading, thinking, and teaching. It was ambitious in scope, drawing on myths from ancient Egypt and Greece, from India and China, from Native American traditions and Polynesian islands, from Celtic legends and African tribal stories. And its central argument was bold. Beneath all these diverse stories lay a single pattern, a monomyth, a universal structure that reflected fundamental truths about human psychology and the life journey. The book did not become an immediate bestseller, but it found its audience among scholars, writers, artists, and seekers. It influenced a generation of thinkers and creators. And slowly, over the decades, Campbell's ideas permeated the culture, shaping how people understood not just ancient myths, but the structure of storytelling itself, the patterns of personal growth, and the symbolic language through which humans make meaning of existence. Campbell continued teaching at Sarah Lawrence and writing prolifically. He published The Masks of God, a 4-volume series exploring primitive, Oriental, Occidental, and creative mythology. He edited and annotated collections of myths from around the world. He lectured widely, bringing his synthesis to audiences far beyond the academic world. He became known for his engaging speaking style, his ability to make complex ideas accessible, his infectious enthusiasm for the subject matter. But it was in 1988, the year of his death, that Campbell would reach his widest audience. The 6-part PBS television series, The Power of Myth, featuring conversations between Campbell and journalist Bill Moyers, was broadcast to millions of viewers. Filmed at George Lucas's Skywalker Ranch and edited after Campbell's death from esophageal cancer, the series brought Campbell's ideas about mythology, meaning, and following your bliss into living rooms across America. The accompanying book became a bestseller, introducing Campbell to people who might never have encountered him otherwise. Joseph Campbell died on the 30th of October 1987 in Honolulu, Hawaii, at the age of 83. He and Jean had maintained an apartment in Honolulu for many years, drawn to the natural beauty of the islands and the rich mythological traditions of Polynesian culture. His death came after a rich, full life devoted to the study and teaching of mythology. But his influence continued to grow after his death, particularly as the power of myth reached audiences and his writings found new generations of readers. The life of Joseph Campbell, then, followed a pattern that he himself had identified in the myths he studied. He heard a call in childhood, an attraction to the mysterious world of Native American culture and the larger realm of human storytelling. He crossed a threshold when he withdrew from conventional academic life and spent years in the wilderness of his own intensive study. He faced ordeals, the struggle to find his voice, to synthesize the vast material he had gathered, to articulate his vision. He found treasures of insight and wisdom, and he returned to the ordinary world, bringing with him the boon of a new understanding of mythology, which he shared through his teaching, his writing, and his public speaking. He lived the hero's journey, and in living it, he helped others to recognize that pattern in their own lives. But who was Joseph Campbell beyond the arc of his biography? What was the quality of the man, the temperament that made him suited to this particular work? Those who knew him described a man of warmth and humor, deeply learned but never pedantic, capable of seeing connections that others missed. He had what might be called a mythological sensibility, a way of perceiving the world as shot through with meaning, where events were not merely facts but symbols, where stories were not entertainment but revelation. He moved through the world of scholarship with the enthusiasm of a child in that museum, still dazzled by the masks and totems, still convinced that the old stories had something urgent to say to the modern world. There was in Campbell a quality of synthetic genius. Where some scholars specialized ever more narrowly, Campbell ranged widely, pulling insights from anthropology, psychology, literature, art history, and comparative religion. He could discuss the Aboriginal Dreamtime and medieval alchemy, Buddhist mandalas, and Native American trickster tales, all in a single lecture, and make you see how they illuminated each other. This was not superficial eclecticism, but a genuine attempt to perceive the patterns that united disparate traditions. He believed that humanity, despite its surface divisions, was fundamentally one, and that this oneness was reflected in the recurring themes of world mythology. Yet Campbell was not without his contradictions and limitations. His universalism, while inclusive in its intent, sometimes flattened important differences among cultures. His focus on commonalities could overshadow the specific historical and social contexts in which myths arose and functioned. Critics, particularly in later decades, pointed out that his hero's journey was predominantly masculine in its orientation, reflecting a male perspective on the life cycle and marginalizing women's experiences and stories. His writings on gender, influenced by the Jungian framework of anima and animus, often struck later readers as essentialist and outdated. He could be defensive about mythology's status, sometimes overstating its explanatory power or dismissing social science perspectives that complicated his neat patterns. These critiques have merit and reflect the limitations of mid-20th century scholarship more broadly. Yet they do not entirely diminish Campbell's achievement. He succeeded in bringing mythology back to cultural centrality at a time when it had been relegated to the margins, treated as either primitive superstition or mere entertainment. He articulated a vision of myth as psychologically necessary, as a language for truths that could not be expressed in merely literal terms. And perhaps most importantly, he lived with a kind of joyful conviction that made others believe, if only for a moment, that the old stories still mattered, that the gods were not dead, but sleeping, waiting for us to remember the language in which they spoke. In his personal philosophy, Campbell was drawn to Eastern thought, particularly Buddhism and Vedanta. He was fascinated by the concept of Maya, the idea that the phenomenal world is in some sense illusory, a play of forms behind which lies an undifferentiated ultimate reality. Yet he was also deeply influenced by the Western tradition, by the Romantic poets and their vision of imagination as a faculty that perceives truth, by medieval mysticism and its language of spiritual transformation. He sought to reconcile East and West, to show that behind the apparent opposition of traditions lay a deeper unity of human spiritual aspiration. Campbell's famous phrase, "follow your bliss," encapsulated his life philosophy. It was not, as some critics charged, a call to selfish hedonism or narcissistic self-indulgence. Rather, it reflected Campbell's belief that each person has a unique calling, a deep inner joy that arises when one is aligned with one's authentic path. This bliss is not mere pleasure, but a sense of rightness, of being in harmony with the deeper currents of one's life. To follow your bliss, in Campbell's sense, is to listen to that inner voice that knows what you are truly meant to be and do, and to have the courage to pursue it despite the world's expectations or the security of conventional paths. It was advice that Campbell himself had followed when he abandoned his doctoral studies to read in that cabin in Woodstock, and again when he chose to remain at Sarah Lawrence rather than pursue more prestigious positions at research universities. He had followed his bliss, and it had led him to a life of meaning and contribution. As we trace the contours of Campbell's life, we see a pattern that he himself might have recognized. The life as myth, the biography as narrative with its own archetypal structure. There is something fitting about this, something that validates his central insight. If myths are indeed patterns of human experience, then a life lived with awareness and authenticity should trace mythic contours. Campbell's life becomes evidence for his theory, a case study in what it means to embark on a hero's journey in the modern world, where the dragons are internal and the treasures are psychological and spiritual rather than material. Now let us turn from the man to his work, from the life lived to the ideas articulated, from biography to the realm of theory and interpretation. Let us explore what Joseph Campbell discovered in all those years of reading and reflection? What patterns he discerned beneath the surface variety of human storytelling? What psychological truths he believed were encoded in the ancient myths? At the heart of Campbell's vision lies the concept of the monomyth, a term he borrowed from James Joyce but made distinctly his own. The monomyth is the idea that all mythological narratives are fundamentally variations on a single story structure. This structure is the hero's journey, and it unfolds in a sequence of stages that Campbell identified with remarkable precision. To understand Campbell's work, one must first grasp this central pattern, for it is the key that unlocks his entire project. The hero's journey begins in the ordinary world, the familiar realm of everyday existence. The hero is living a normal life, often one that has become constricted or unsatisfying in some way. There is a sense that something is missing, that the full potential of life is not being realized. Then comes the call to adventure, the moment when the hero is invited or compelled to leave the familiar and venture into the unknown. This call might come in many forms: a mysterious message, an encounter with a strange figure, a crisis that demands response, an inner restlessness that will not be denied. The call is the first threshold, the first disruption of the ordinary. Often, the hero initially refuses the call. There is fear, doubt, reluctance to leave the security of the known world. Campbell identified this refusal as an important stage because it reflects a genuine psychological reality, the resistance we feel to change, to growth, to the unknown. But something happens, circumstances intensify, an ally appears, or the hero's own dissatisfaction becomes unbearable, and eventually the threshold is crossed. The hero steps out of the ordinary world and into the realm of adventure. Once the threshold is crossed, the hero enters a world of unfamiliar forces, where the ordinary rules do not apply. This is the realm of trial and transformation. Here, the hero encounters allies and enemies, faces tests and ordeals, descends into dark places, both literal and psychological. There are often helpers along the way: the wise old man or woman who provides guidance, the magical gift that aids in the quest, the companions who journey alongside. But ultimately, the hero must face the supreme ordeal alone, the confrontation with death, or the greatest fear, the moment of ultimate testing. In this darkest moment, something essential happens. The hero dies and is reborn, or confronts the monster and defeats it, or retrieves the treasure that was the object of the quest. This is the moment of apotheosis, of transformation, of obtaining the boon. The hero has been changed by the journey. Something that was lost has been recovered, or something new has been gained. The scattered pieces of the self have been integrated. The dragon has been slain, or has revealed itself to be an ally. The prisoner has been freed, or the elixir obtained. But the journey is not complete. The hero must now return to the ordinary world, bringing the boon back to the community. This return can be as challenging as the outward journey. There is the temptation to remain in the transcendent realm, to refuse to return to the limitations of ordinary life. There may be a final chase, a last set of obstacles. But if the hero successfully navigates the return, the boon is shared. The knowledge or power or wisdom obtained in the realm of adventure is brought back and used to renew the community, to heal the land, to restore what was broken. The final stage is what Campbell called the master of two worlds. The hero has been transformed by the journey and can now move freely between the ordinary and the extraordinary, understanding that they are not separate realms but interpenetrating dimensions of a single reality. The hero has achieved a kind of wholeness, an integration of the conscious and unconscious, the individual and the collective, the temporal and the eternal. This is the goal of the mythic journey, not mere external adventure, but internal transformation. Campbell illustrated this pattern with examples drawn from mythologies around the world. He showed how the Buddha's life followed this structure. The prince Siddhartha leaving the palace, wandering as an ascetic, sitting under the Bodhi tree in meditation, achieving enlightenment, and then spending the rest of his life teaching what he had learned. He showed how Moses went into the desert, encountered the divine in the burning bush, received the tablets on Mount Sinai, and brought them back to his people. He showed how the Greek hero Perseus received the call to slay Medusa, was aided by gods and magical implements, confronted the terrible Gorgon, and returned with her head to save his people. He showed how Jesus withdrew into the wilderness, was tempted, began his teaching ministry, died and was resurrected, and through his death and return brought the boon of salvation to humanity. But Campbell's point was not merely to catalog similarities. He wanted to explain why this pattern recurred so universally. His answer drew on Jungian psychology. The hero's journey, Campbell argued, is an externalization of an internal psychological process. It maps the path of individuation, the journey towards psychological wholeness that every person must undertake in their own way. The ordinary world represents ego consciousness, the limited perspective of the everyday self. The call to adventure represents the promptings of the unconscious, the sense that there is more to life than what we have known. The crossing of the threshold represents the decision to engage with the unconscious, to explore the depths of the psyche. The trials and ordeals of the journey represent the confrontation with aspects of ourselves that we have denied or repressed, with the shadow parts of the personality, with fears and traumas and complexes. The allies and helpers represent positive resources in the unconscious, the archetypal figures that can guide and strengthen us. The supreme ordeal, the confrontation with death or the monster, represents the ego's encounter with something greater than itself, the moment when the limited self must dissolve to make room for a larger identity. The obtaining of the boon represents the integration of unconscious contents into consciousness, the achievement of a more complete sense of self, and the return represents the necessity of bringing these insights back into everyday life, of integrating the extraordinary experiences of the inner journey into the practical world of relationships, work, and community. The master of two worlds represents psychological maturity, the ability to honor both the transcendent and the immanent, the spiritual and the material, the depths and the surface. This was a powerful interpretive framework. It suggested that myths were not ancient superstitions, but psychological maps, that the heroes and gods of old stories were symbols of forces within the human psyche, and that the strange landscapes of myth, the forests and castles, the underworlds and heavens, were depictions of inner psychological territory. To read a myth was to see a mirror of your own potential journey toward wholeness. Campbell elaborated this framework in The Hero with 1,000 Faces, moving through the stages of the journey with meticulous attention to cross-cultural parallels. He quoted extensively from myths, sacred texts, and anthropological reports, building a mosaic of evidence for his central claim. The book was dense, scholarly, yet animated by a passion and a sense of discovery that made it accessible to general readers. It spoke to something that people intuitively sensed, that beneath the chaos of modern life, beneath the apparent meaninglessness that haunted the 20th century, there were patterns, meanings, truths encoded in the old stories. After The Hero with 1,000 Faces, Campbell continued to develop and elaborate his mythological vision in subsequent works. His 4-volume series, The Masks of God, represented an even more ambitious project, a comprehensive survey of world mythology arranged both geographically and chronologically, showing how mythological consciousness had evolved from primitive shamanism through the great civilizations of the East and West and into the modern creative era. In the first volume, Primitive Mythology, Campbell explored the mythological systems of tribal peoples, from the Paleolithic cave paintings of Europe to the rituals of Australian Aborigines, from African tribal myths to the ceremonies of Native American peoples. He argued that primitive mythology was rooted in a sense of participation, mystique, a consciousness in which the boundary between self and world, human and animal, matter and spirit, was fluid and permeable. Primitive peoples, Campbell suggested, experienced the world as animate, alive with spiritual forces. Their myths and rituals served to maintain harmony with these forces, to ensure successful hunts and harvests, to mark transitions in the human life cycle, to provide a framework of meaning for existence. Campbell was fascinated by the shamanic traditions that seemed to be the earliest form of religious practice. The shaman was the archetypal hero of primitive cultures, the one who journeyed into the spirit world, who could cross the boundary between the human and the divine, who brought back healing and knowledge. The shamanic journey, with its elements of descent into darkness, confrontation with spirits, and return with power, was for Campbell a clear instance of the hero's journey pattern. It suggested that the mythic structure had roots deep in human prehistory, perhaps even in neurological structures of the brain that predisposed humans to experience transformation in this particular narrative shape. In the second volume, Oriental Mythology, Campbell examined the great mythological systems of Asia, the intricate cosmologies of Hinduism, the path of liberation in Buddhism, the harmonious order of Confucian thought, the spontaneous naturalness of Taoism, the mythic histories of Japan and Indonesia. He was particularly drawn to the Eastern concept of the ultimate unity underlying all apparent diversity. In Hindu thought, the multiplicity of gods and forms is understood as manifestations of a single ultimate reality, Brahman, which is identical with the deepest self, Atman. The goal of spiritual practice is to realize this identity, to see through the illusion of separateness to the underlying oneness. Campbell found in Eastern mythology a sophisticated vision that resonated with his own synthesizing impulse. The Eastern traditions seemed to understand that myths were not literally true, but symbolically true, that the gods were not supernatural beings to be believed in, but symbols of psychological and cosmic truths. This gave Eastern mythology a flexibility and depth that Campbell admired. He was particularly influenced by the concept of Lila, the divine play, the idea that the creation and dissolution of worlds is a kind of cosmic dance or game, undertaken not out of necessity, but as a spontaneous expression of creative joy. The third volume, Occidental Mythology, traced the mythological traditions of the West, from the early Near Eastern civilizations of Sumer and Babylon through the biblical traditions of Judaism and Christianity to the European Middle Ages. Here, Campbell's analysis became more critical. He argued that Western mythology, particularly in its biblical form, had taken a wrong turn by emphasizing the radical separation between God and creation, spirit and matter, the sacred and the profane. Unlike the Eastern view of underlying unity, the Western view insisted on duality, on the gulf between the divine and the human. This dualistic framework, Campbell argued, had profound psychological consequences. It led to a devaluation of nature, the body, and earthly life, which were seen as fallen, corrupt, inferior to the spiritual realm. It led to rigid moral codes that divided human experience into good and evil, with little room for ambiguity. It created a psychology of guilt and sin rather than one of wholeness and integration. Campbell was particularly critical of the doctrine of original sin and the emphasis on obedience to divine commandment, rather than on personal spiritual experience and transformation. Yet Campbell also found redemptive threads in Western mythology. He was drawn to the mystical traditions within Christianity, to figures like Meister Eckhart and Jakob Boehme, who spoke of direct union with the divine, of the spark of divinity within the human soul. He was fascinated by the Grail legends and the courtly love tradition, which seemed to honor the feminine and the earthly in ways that mainstream Christian theology did not. He saw in these alternative traditions a Western path toward the kind of integrated mythological consciousness that he admired in the East. The fourth volume, Creative Mythology, addressed the modern era and the challenge of creating meaningful mythic narratives in a time when the old mythologies had lost their authority. Campbell argued that the traditional function of mythology to provide a shared symbolic language that oriented individuals within their community and cosmos had broken down in the modern world. Science had demythologized the universe, revealing it as a vast mechanism rather than a meaningful order. Historical criticism had shown that sacred texts were human documents, products of specific times and places rather than timeless revelations. Globalization had brought diverse mythologies into contact, making the claim of any single tradition to exclusive truth untenable. But Campbell did not see this as a cause for despair. Instead, he argued that modernity called for a new kind of mythology, one he termed creative mythology. This would not be a collectively imposed system, but a personally discovered one. Each individual would have to become their own mythmaker, drawing on the vast repository of world mythology to construct a meaningful narrative for their own life. Artists and writers were the pioneers of this creative mythology. Individuals like Joyce and Mann and Picasso, who drew on mythic themes and patterns to create works that spoke to contemporary experience while resonating with ancient wisdom. Campbell's vision of creative mythology was essentially optimistic. He believed that the human psyche continued to generate mythic symbols and narratives, that the archetypal depths of the unconscious remained active, even when traditional religious forms had lost their power. Dreams continue to employ mythic imagery. Artists continue to create works that moved audiences in ways that logical discourse could not. People continue to live out variations of the hero's journey in their own lives, even if they did not recognize the pattern. The task was to become conscious of this myth-making process, to recognize the mythic dimension of experience, to honor the symbolic language of the psyche. This emphasis on the continuing vitality of myth brought Campbell into dialogue with Jungian psychology, and this dialogue shaped much of his mature work. Carl Jung had proposed that the human psyche contains, in addition to the personal unconscious of repressed memories and experiences, a deeper collective unconscious shared by all humanity. This collective unconscious is structured by archetypes, universal patterns of psychological experience that manifest in myths, dreams, art, and religious visions across cultures. Jung had identified numerous archetypes: the self, the center and totality of the psyche, the shadow, the repressed or denied aspects of personality, the anima and animus, the feminine and masculine components of the psyche, the wise old man and great mother, sources of guidance and nurture, the hero, the ego's quest for identity and wholeness, the trickster, the disruptive force that breaks down rigid structures. These archetypal figures appeared again and again in the world's myths, suggesting that myths were expressions of the collective unconscious, that they emerged from the deep structures of the human mind, rather than being invented arbitrarily. Campbell embraced this framework enthusiastically. It provided a psychological rationale for the cross-cultural similarities he had been documenting. If myths arose from archetypes in the collective unconscious, then it made sense that similar figures and patterns would appear in cultures with no historical contact. The hero's journey itself could be understood as the archetypal pattern of individuation, the psyche's inherent drive toward wholeness and integration. The various mythic figures, the wise old man, the helpful animal, the dangerous woman, the evil king, could be understood as projections of archetypal contents, as the psyche's way of giving form to inner experiences. Campbell attended and spoke at the Eranos conferences in Ascana, Switzerland, gatherings organized by the Jungian analyst Olga Froba-Kaptein that brought together scholars of religion, mythology, psychology, and philosophy. At these conferences, Campbell interacted with Jungian analysts and other thinkers who were exploring the symbolic dimensions of human experience. He deepened his understanding of Jungian concepts and refined his own mythological framework in dialogue with these scholars. The influence flowed both ways. Campbell brought his vast knowledge of world mythology to bear on Jungian theory, while Jung's psychology provided Campbell with interpretive tools for understanding mythic material. Yet Campbell was not simply applying Jung's theory mechanically to mythology. He brought his own insights and emphases to the synthesis. Where Jung was primarily concerned with individual psychological healing, Campbell was equally interested in the social and cultural functions of mythology. He explored how myths served to integrate individuals into their communities, how they provided models for living, how they sanctified social structures and values. He examined the ways that myths could be manipulative, used by priestly classes to maintain power, or liberating, opening paths to transcendent experience. He was attentive to the aesthetic dimensions of myth, the way that great mythological narratives functioned as works of art, moving audiences through beauty and poetry, as well as through psychological resonance. Campbell also had a more historical and evolutionary perspective than Jung. He traced how mythological consciousness had changed over the millennia, from the hunting cultures of the Paleolithic, with their animal deities and shamanic journeys, through the agricultural civilizations with their fertility goddesses and dying and rising gods, to the urban empires with their celestial hierarchies and cosmic order, and finally, to the modern era with its skepticism and individualism. He saw mythology as evolving in response to changing social and economic conditions, even as certain archetypal patterns persisted beneath the surface transformations. One of Campbell's most important contributions was his attention to the mythological significance of ritual. Myths, he argued, are not just stories, but scripts for action. They are enacted in rituals, ceremonies, and sacred dramas. A ritual is a myth in motion, a myth made experiential. When a tribal initiate undergoes an initiation ceremony, when a Christian takes communion, when a Buddhist performs a meditation practice, they are entering into the mythic reality, participating in the sacred narrative, allowing the myth to act upon them transformatively. Campbell explored the great ritual complexes of world religions, the elaborate sacrificial ceremonies of Vedic India, the mystery initiations of ancient Greece, the Mass and sacraments of Christianity, the vision quests of Native Americans, the koan practice of Zen Buddhism. He showed how these rituals serve to induce altered states of consciousness, to detach participants from ordinary reality and immerse them in mythic time and space. In this sacred dimension, transformations became possible that could not occur in ordinary consciousness. The initiate died to their old identity and was reborn into a new one. The participant received a vision or insight that reoriented their understanding of reality. The worshipper experienced a union with the divine, a moment of ego dissolution and cosmic consciousness. These ritual experiences, Campbell argued, were not pathological or delusional, but rather essential to psychological health. They provided a sanctioned context for exploring non-ordinary states of consciousness, for confronting the depths of the psyche, for experiencing the numinous dimensions of reality. Modern Western culture, with its emphasis on rational consciousness and its suspicion of ritual, had lost access to these transformative experiences, and Campbell believed this loss contributed to widespread feelings of meaninglessness and alienation. Campbell was particularly interested in the symbolism of initiation rituals, which he saw as enactments of the death and rebirth pattern at the heart of the hero's journey. In traditional cultures, initiation marks the transition from childhood to adulthood, from dependence to responsibility, from ignorance to knowledge. The initiate is taken from the community, often into a wilderness or sacred space. They undergo ordeals, fasting, isolation, painful procedures, confrontations with frightening masked figures representing spirits or ancestors. These ordeals strip away the childhood identity. There is a symbolic death, sometimes represented by the initiate being swallowed by a monster or buried. Then comes rebirth, as the initiate emerges with a new name, new knowledge, new status. They return to the community as a full member, having proven their capacity to endure hardship and to connect with the spiritual realm. Campbell lamented the absence of meaningful initiation rituals in modern Western society. Young people, he argued, had no clear markers of the transition to adulthood, no structured challenges that would test them and transform them. The result was prolonged adolescence, confused identity, a sense of drifting without purpose. Some young people sought out their own ordeals through drugs, dangerous behavior, or immersion in subcultures as unconscious attempts to create an initiatory experience. Campbell believed that restoring meaningful initiation would address many of the psychological problems of modernity. Another major theme in Campbell's work was the role of the hero as a mediator between the human and the divine, the conscious and the unconscious, the community and the transcendent. The hero is not simply an adventurer or a warrior, but a sacred figure who brings something essential from the other world back to the human realm. This mediating function is clearest in the figure of the shaman, who journeys to the spirit world to retrieve souls, to gain knowledge of healing, to intercede with the gods on behalf of the community. But it is also present in the prophet who brings divine revelation, the sage who attains enlightenment, the culture hero, who steals fire from the gods, or teaches humanity agriculture. The hero's mediating role points to a fundamental function of mythology, to connect the human realm with a larger cosmos, to situate human life within a meaningful framework that transcends the merely personal. Traditional mythologies accomplish this by depicting a sacred cosmos, a universe saturated with meaning, purpose, and spiritual forces. The gods, ancestors, and spirits are not distant, but intimately involved in the world. The natural world is not dead matter, but alive with presence. Human actions have cosmic significance. Rituals maintain the harmony of the universe. Violations of sacred law bring divine retribution. In such a mythologically ordered world, the individual knows their place and purpose. The myths provide answers to the existential questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What happens after death? How should we live? The myths locate the individual within a story larger than themselves, a sacred narrative in which they have a role to play. This provides a sense of security, meaning, and dignity that modern secular worldviews often fail to offer. Campbell contrasted this traditional mythological consciousness with the modern condition, which he characterized as one of disconnection and alienation. The Copernican revolution had displaced Earth from the center of the cosmos. Darwinian evolution had replaced the story of divine creation with the blind mechanism of natural selection. The scientific worldview depicted the universe as vast, ancient, indifferent to human concerns, governed by impersonal laws rather than by purposeful divine will. Human beings were accidents of evolution, insignificant specks in an immense cosmos, their lives brief and ultimately meaningless in the grand scheme. This demythologized worldview, Campbell argued, left people without the psychologically necessary sense of cosmic belonging. It answered the questions of how the planets move, how life evolved, how matter is structured, but not the questions of why and for what purpose. It gave knowledge but not wisdom, information but not meaning. The result was the characteristically modern sense of existential emptiness, the feeling that life is absurd, that there is no transcendent purpose, that we are alone in a cold, meaningless universe. But Campbell did not believe that we could or should simply return to pre-modern mythologies. The scientific worldview, however psychologically challenging, was based on genuine knowledge. The Earth does orbit the sun. Life did evolve through natural selection. The biblical creation story is not literally true. To reject science in favor of mythological literalism would be intellectual dishonesty. The challenge, as Campbell saw it, was to find a way to honor both scientific truth and mythological meaning, to recognize that myths are not literal descriptions of the physical world, but symbolic descriptions of the psychological and spiritual dimensions of existence. This is why Campbell insisted on reading myths symbolically rather than literally. A myth is not a false scientific hypothesis, but a different kind of truth claim. When a myth says that the world was created from the body of a slain god, it is not making a statement about cosmology, but about the nature of existence, that life feeds on life, that creation involves sacrifice, that the sacred and the material are intimately intertwined. When a myth describes a hero descending into the underworld, it is not giving a geography lesson, but mapping an inner journey into the depths of the psyche, into the confrontation with death and the unconscious. Read symbolically. Myths remain true even in a scientific age. the hero's journey is still a valid map of psychological transformation, even if we know that the underworld is not a literal place beneath the earth. The archetypes of the collective unconscious still manifest in dreams and imagination, even if we understand them as products of brain activity rather than as independent spiritual entities. The great myths can still move us, inspire us, guide us, if we learn to hear their symbolic language. This emphasis on symbolic interpretation was central to Campbell's popular appeal. He made mythology accessible to modern audiences by showing that the old stories were not irrelevant superstitions, but timeless wisdom expressed in symbolic form. He taught people to read myths as one might read poetry or view art, not for literal information, but for emotional resonance, for insight into the human condition, for images that speak to something deeper than rational consciousness. Campbell's phrase, "follow your bliss," became perhaps his most famous teaching, though it was often misunderstood. It appeared in his later work and was prominently featured in The Power of Myth, Conversations with Bill Moyers. By bliss, Campbell did not mean mere pleasure or self-indulgence. He meant something more profound, a deep sense of rightness, of being aligned with one's true calling, of doing what one was meant to do. This bliss is often accompanied by a feeling of effortlessness, of energy, and enthusiasm, of time passing unnoticed, because one is fully absorbed in the activity. To follow your bliss, in Campbell's sense, is to pay attention to those moments when you feel most alive, most authentically yourself, most connected to something larger than your ego. It is to have the courage to pursue that path, even when it does not conform to conventional expectations of success or security. It is to trust that if you follow the deep call of your own being, doors will open, opportunities will appear, and your life will have meaning, even if it does not have material rewards. This teaching reflected Campbell's own life experience. He had followed his bliss when he withdrew from the doctoral program to read in the cabin, trusting that the intensive study of mythology was his true path, even though it offered no clear career prospects. He had followed it when he accepted the position as Sarah Lawrence, a small college where he could teach what he loved rather than pursuing a round, prestigious research position at a major university. He had followed it throughout his life, always choosing depth over breadth, meaning over money, authentic engagement over professional advancement. But follow your bliss was also rooted in Campbell's mythological understanding. In myths, the hero often begins the journey by following a deep inner prompting, a call that makes no logical sense but feels utterly necessary. The call is not reasonable or prudent, it is compulsive, irresistible, and the hero who answers the call, who has the courage to step into the unknown, is the one who finds transformation and brings back the boon. The hero who refuses the call, who clings to safety and convention, remains stuck, unfulfilled, cut off from their own depths. Campbell saw this pattern playing out in individual lives. Those who had the courage to follow their bliss, to pursue their deepest calling despite obstacles and discouragement, often found that their lives became meaningful, narratives, modern versions of the hero's journey. They crossed thresholds, faced ordeals, underwent transformations, and often ended up making contributions to their communities and fields that would not have been possible had they followed safer, more conventional paths. By contrast, those who ignored the inner call, who chose security over authenticity, often found themselves in midlife crisis, suddenly aware that they had been living someone else's story rather than their own. The follow your bliss philosophy was not without its critics. Some argued that it was elitist, that only those with economic privilege could afford to follow their bliss rather than simply trying to survive. Others saw it as representative of the narcissistic self-absorption of later 20th century American culture, the cult of self-fulfillment that ignored social responsibilities. These critiques had some validity. Campbell was speaking from a position of relative privilege, and his emphasis on individual fulfillment could sound insensitive to those struggling with poverty, discrimination, or other structural barriers. Yet there was also something profoundly democratic about Campbell's vision. He was saying that every person, regardless of social position, has a unique calling, a distinctive contribution to make, a hero's journey to undertake. The journey might not be conventionally heroic. It might be the journey of raising children with love, or creating beauty in a small sphere, or simply learning to live with integrity despite hardship. The point was not the external achievement, but the internal alignment, the sense of living authentically, of being true to one's deepest nature. Campbell's impact extended far beyond academic scholarship into the realms of popular culture, particularly in the world of storytelling. Perhaps the most famous example of this influence is George Lucas's Star Wars saga. Lucas has acknowledged that he was deeply influenced by Campbell's crack, the hero with 1,000 faces, while developing the story of Luke Skywalker. The parallels are clear. Luke is living an ordinary life on Tatooine when he receives a call to adventure through R2-D2's message from Princess Leia. He initially refuses, wanting to stay on the farm, but circumstances force him to cross the threshold. He finds a mentor in Obi-Wan Kenobi, the wise old man. He gathers allies, faces trials, descends into the Death Star, the belly of the whale, confronts the evil father, and ultimately brings the boon of hope and freedom back to the galaxy. Star Wars became one of the most successful and influential film franchises of all time, and its success demonstrated the power of mythological storytelling in modern media. Audiences responded to the story at a deep level, not because it was realistic or original in a conventional sense, but because it tapped into archetypal patterns that resonated with something in the collective unconscious. The film's use of clear, mythological structure, archetypal characters, and symbolic imagery created a modern mythology that functioned for millions of viewers, much as traditional myths had functioned for earlier cultures, providing a framework of meaning, depicting the struggle between good and evil, showing the path of transformation from ignorance to wisdom. Campbell and Lucas became friends, and Campbell visited Lucas's Skywalker Ranch, where the Power of Myth interviews were filmed. Campbell praised Lucas for understanding the mythological dimension of storytelling, for recognizing that the most powerful narratives are those that connect to the deep structures of human psychology. The success of Star Wars seemed to validate Campbell's entire project. It showed that mythological narratives were not merely ancient curiosities, but living forces that could still move and inspire modern audiences. Beyond Lucas, Campbell influenced countless writers, filmmakers, and storytellers. Screenwriting manuals began to teach the hero's journey as a fundamental story structure. Christopher Vogler's The Writer's Journey, explicitly based on Campbell's work, became a standard reference in Hollywood. Films ranging from The Matrix to The Lion King to Harry Potter can be read as variations on the hero's journey pattern. Whether consciously intended or not, these stories followed the monomyth structure. the ordinary world, the call to adventure, the mentor, the threshold crossing, the trials, the transformation, the return. This widespread influence raised interesting questions. Was Campbell's framework being vindicated by its success in contemporary storytelling, or was it creating a kind of narrative monoculture where diverse stories were all being forced into a single template? Critics argued that the obsessive focus on the hero's journey, particularly in Hollywood, led to formulaic storytelling, where every narrative had to follow the same beats, where character development and thematic complexity were sacrificed to structural predictability. They noted that the hero's journey, with its emphasis on the individual male hero, marginalized other kinds of stories, community-based narratives, women's stories, tragedies, non-Western narrative structures. These criticisms pointed to real limitations in Campbell's framework. His universalism, his insistence that all stories were variations on a single pattern, could indeed be reductive. Not all meaningful narratives follow the hero's journey structure. Some cultures have storytelling traditions that privilege different patterns, circular rather than linear narratives, ensemble rather than individual heroes, ambiguity rather than resolution. Campbell's framework, despite its cross-cultural ambitions, was arguably most applicable to Western and particularly Indo-European mythologies, where the individual hero's quest is indeed a dominant pattern. Moreover, Campbell's hero's journey was, as critics noted, predominantly masculine in its orientation. The hero is typically male, venturing out into the world, confronting external challenges, and winning treasures through struggle and combat. The feminine figures in these stories are often relegated to supporting roles. The temptress who distracts the hero, the goddess who grants him boons, the prize to be won at the journey's end. Campbell, drawing on Jungian psychology, interpreted these feminine figures as symbols of the hero's inner life, the anima, the feminine aspect of the male psyche. But this interpretive move, while psychologically interesting, still positioned women as symbols rather than as subjects in their own right. In later decades, feminist scholars challenged Campbell's framework and proposed alternative patterns for women's journeys. Maureen Murdoch's The Heroine's Journey suggested that women's development followed a different path, focused not on separation and conquest, but on integration and relationship, on healing splits between feminine and masculine aspects of the self, on reclaiming what had been devalued in patriarchal culture. Other scholars pointed to goddesses and female heroes in world mythology whose stories did not fit Campbell's pattern, or explored traditions where the feminine principle was central rather than peripheral. Campbell's response to such criticisms in his later years was somewhat defensive. He acknowledged that his work had focused primarily on male heroes, but argued that he was describing the myths as they existed, not prescribing how stories should be. He maintained that the hero's journey was a genuine psychological pattern rooted in the process of ego development and individuation, and that while women's experiences might differ in some respects, the basic pattern of separation, initiation, and return was universal. Yet Campbell's critics had identified a real blind spot in his work. His emphasis on universal patterns sometimes led him to overlook or minimize important differences, not only gender differences, but also cultural, historical, and contextual specificity. A myth is not just a timeless archetypal pattern. It is also a product of a particular society at a particular moment, embedded in specific social relations, power structures, and historical conditions. To read myths only for their archetypal content is to miss much of their meaning and function. Despite these limitations, Campbell's work opened up mythology as a field of study and appreciation for vast audiences. Before Campbell, mythology was primarily the province of specialists, classicists, anthropologists, folklorists. Campbell brought mythology into the mainstream, showed that ordinary people could engage with these stories meaningfully, that myths were not the exclusive property of academics or clergy but belonged to everyone. He democratized access to the world's sacred narratives and provided tools for understanding them. Campbell's The Power of Myth series, broadcast on PBS shortly after his death, reached millions of viewers and became a cultural phenomenon. In these conversations with Bill Moyers, Campbell ranged widely over his favorite themes: the hero's journey, the function of mythology, the importance of ritual, the need for symbolic literacy, the relevance of ancient wisdom to modern life. He was charming, eloquent, and passionate, speaking with the enthusiasm of someone who had spent a lifetime studying what he loved. He told stories, illustrated concepts with examples from diverse traditions, and made complex ideas accessible without dumbing them down. One of the most compelling aspects of these conversations was Campbell's ability to show the relevance of mythology to contemporary concerns. He discussed marriage and relationships through the lens of mythological partnerships between gods and goddesses. He addressed environmental issues by exploring how different mythologies envision humanity's relationship to nature. He talked about war and peace, creation and destruction, love and death, always drawing on mythological material to illuminate these perennial human concerns. He made viewers feel that the old stories had something to say about their lives, that engaging with mythology was not an academic exercise, but a way of enriching one's understanding of existence. The series came at an opportune moment. The 1,980 seconds in America were a time of searching for meaning, of interest in spirituality and self-development, of hunger for something deeper than materialism and conventional religion. Campbell offered a vision that was spiritual without being dogmatic, that honored the world's religious traditions without requiring adherence to any particular creed, that suggested that meaning was available to anyone willing to undertake the inner journey. The series struck a chord, and Campbell's books, many of which had been out of print, were reissued and became bestsellers. Campbell's influence extended into the therapeutic world as well. Therapists and counselors drew on his ideas to help clients understand their own life narratives. The hero's journey became a framework for conceptualizing personal growth and healing. A person struggling with depression might be encouraged to see themselves as being in the belly of the whale, the dark phase of the journey, where everything seems lost, but where transformation is germinating. Someone facing a major life transition, career change, divorce, retirement, might be helped to see it as a threshold crossing, a departure from the known world that, while frightening, offers the possibility of renewal. The concept of the call to adventure could help people recognize and honor their own inner promptings toward change. This therapeutic application of Campbell's work was particularly associated with the work of therapists influenced by Jungian psychology. Jungian analysts had always worked with mythological material using myths and fairy tales as resources for understanding clients' dreams and psychological processes. Campbell's work provided an additional layer of structure and clarity, a specific map of the transformation process that could be applied clinically. The hero's journey became a narrative framework for the therapeutic process itself. The client enters therapy, crosses the threshold, works with the therapist, the mentor, confronts painful material, the trials and ordeals, achieves insights and integration, obtains the boon, and emerges with greater wholeness, returns to the ordinary world. Yet there were risks in applying Campbell's framework too literally or rigidly in therapy. Not everyone's life follows a neat narrative arc. Some people face chronic conditions that do not resolve into transformation and return. Some traumas do not lead to growth. Some journeys do not have a clear ending. The danger was in imposing a mythological narrative on a life that did not fit it, in creating expectations of heroic transformation that might not be realistic or helpful. Good therapists used Campbell's framework flexibly, as one possible way of understanding experience rather than as a mandatory structure. Campbell's notion of following your bliss also found its way into therapeutic and self-help discourse, where it sometimes became oversimplified. In Campbell's nuanced understanding, following your bliss was a lifelong practice of attention and courage, a willingness to face fear and uncertainty in service of authentic living. In popular self-help culture, it sometimes became a superficial encouragement to do whatever feels good, to abandon responsibilities in pursuit of personal fulfillment. This was not what Campbell meant, but the phrase lent itself to such misinterpretation. Part of what made Campbell's work so influential was his breadth of learning. He had read deeply in multiple traditions, Western and Eastern, ancient and modern, and he could draw on this vast repository of knowledge to illustrate points, make connections, and surprise his readers with unexpected parallels. He might discuss a Native American trickster tale, then show how it related to stories of Hermes in Greek mythology and to the jester in medieval European culture, then connect all of this to psychological concepts of the shadow and the role of humor in disrupting rigid ego structures. This synthetic approach made his work endlessly interesting. You never knew what connection he might make next, what distant traditions he might bring into dialogue. Yet this same breadth could also be a weakness. Campbell was not a specialist in any single tradition. His knowledge of any particular mythology, while extensive, was not as deep as that of specialists in that field. He relied heavily on secondary sources, on translations, on interpretations by others. This meant that his understanding of any particular tradition was mediated, sometimes filtered through the biases and assumptions of earlier scholars. His understanding of Native American mythology, for instance, was shaped by the anthropologists of the early 20th century, who often brought their own cultural assumptions and sometimes romantic projections to the material they studied. Campbell has been criticized, particularly by scholars of specific traditions, for cherry-picking elements that fit his theory while ignoring aspects that complicate it. His claim that all mythologies reflect the same underlying patterns has been challenged by those who work closely with particular traditions and see fundamental differences that Campbell's framework obscures. For instance, scholars of Native American traditions have pointed out that many of these cultures have cyclical rather than linear concepts of time, communal rather than individualistic values, and narrative structures that do not fit the hero's journey pattern. Campbell's attempt to force diverse traditions into a single framework could be seen as a kind of intellectual colonialism, imposing a Western narrative structure onto non-Western material. Similarly, feminist scholars have critiqued Campbell's tendency to interpret female figures in myths, primarily in relation to male heroes, as obstacles or aids or prizes in the hero's journey, rather than as subjects in their own right. This approach reflects the male-centered perspective of many traditional myths, but Campbell's analysis could have done more to critique this bias rather than simply replicating it. His discussion of the goddess, while appreciative in some ways, often reduced feminine divinity to a symbol of nature, matter, or the unconscious, defined in opposition to masculine principles of consciousness, culture, and spirit. These critiques are important and point to real limitations in Campbell's work. Yet they do not entirely negate his achievement. Campbell succeeded in bringing mythology back to cultural centrality, in showing that these stories matter, that they speak to something deep in human psychology. Even if his universal pattern is not as universal as he claimed, even if his interpretations sometimes oversimplify, he opened up a conversation about myth, meaning, and the symbolic dimensions of existence that continues to this day. One of Campbell's most valuable contributions was his insistence on the symbolic reading of myths. In an era when religious fundamentalism often insisted on the literal truth of sacred narratives, Campbell offered a middle path. He honored the profound truths contained in myths, while acknowledging that they were not historical or scientific accounts. A myth, he argued, is not a lie and not a mistake. It is a different kind of truth, a symbolic or poetic truth that speaks to dimensions of reality that cannot be captured in literal language. This distinction between literal and symbolic truth was crucial for Campbell. He often quoted the medieval dictum, "The meaning of the myth is not literalistic, but anagogical." That is, myths point beyond themselves to deeper meanings. When a myth speaks of gods and goddesses, it is not describing supernatural beings in the sky, but symbolizing psychological and cosmic principles. When it depicts creation from chaos, or a divine sacrifice, or a descent into the underworld, it is not recording historical events, but expressing truths about the nature of existence and consciousness. Campbell illustrated this point with the example of the virgin birth. Taken literally, this doctrine has caused endless controversy and conflict. Did Mary conceive without sexual intercourse? Is this biologically possible? If we insist on a literal reading, we must either accept it as a miracle, contradicting our scientific understanding, or reject it as superstition. But Campbell suggested that the virgin birth is not meant to be understood literally. It is a symbol of spiritual rebirth, of the birth of the divine within the human soul, of the capacity for radical transformation that does not come from ordinary biological processes but from a deeper source. Read symbolically, the virgin birth remains meaningful even for those who do not believe it happened historically. This approach allowed Campbell to honor religious traditions without being confined by dogma. He could appreciate the beauty and wisdom of Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, or any other tradition, without needing to accept its literal truth claims. He could see that all traditions were pointing towards similar realities, the transcendent dimension of existence, the mystery of consciousness, the possibility of transformation even while expressing these realities in different symbolic languages. This pluralistic, symbolic approach appealed to many in the late 20th century who felt alienated from traditional religion, but still sensed a spiritual dimension to existence. Campbell offered a way to engage with the world's sacred traditions as sources of wisdom and inspiration, without requiring belief in their specific doctrines. You could study the Bhagavad Gita or the Gospels, or the Egyptian Book of the Dead, not as rival truth claims, but as different expressions of universal human spirituality, each offering unique insights, while participating in a common quest for meaning. Yet this approach also had its critics, particularly among those committed to specific religious traditions. They argued that Campbell's symbolic reading drained myths and scriptures of their power, reducing them to vague psychological truths rather than honoring their specific claims about reality. For believers, the virgin birth, or the resurrection, or the enlightenment of the Buddha are not merely symbols, but real events with real metaphysical significance. To treat them as only symbols, these critics argued, was to miss what makes them truly important. Campbell would have responded that symbolic does not mean merely symbolic, that symbols can be more real and more powerful than literal facts. A symbol, he would say, points to realities that cannot be captured in literal language, opens dimensions of experience that remain closed to purely rational consciousness. The resurrection, understood symbolically as the death and rebirth of the psyche, as the triumph of life over death, as the manifestation of the eternal in time, might be more meaningful and more true than a literal claim that a corpse reanimated. This debate touches on fundamental questions about the nature of truth, meaning, and reality questions that cannot be easily resolved. What is clear is that Campbell's symbolic approach resonated with many people in the modern world, offering a way to engage with mythology and religion that felt authentic and intellectually honest, while still honoring the profound mysteries these traditions address. Now, let us pause in our exploration of Campbell's specific ideas and theories, and allow ourselves to drift into a more reflective, meditative consideration of what his work means in the broader context of human self-understanding, of the quest to know ourselves, of the eternal questions that have haunted and inspired humanity throughout our long history on this planet. Joseph Campbell spent his life studying stories. But what are stories, really? Why do humans tell them? Why do we need them? These questions lead us into deep waters, into mysteries about the nature of consciousness and meaning. Human beings are storytelling creatures. We do not experience life as a succession of disconnected moments, but as narrative. We remember the past as story. We anticipate the future as story. We understand ourselves as characters in the ongoing story of our lives. We make sense of events by fitting them into narrative patterns. This happened because of that. This is the beginning of something that was a turning point. Even in dreams, that most primitive and uncontrolled form of mental activity, we generate narratives, often bizarre and fragmentary, but still organized as sequences of events with characters and actions. This narrative quality of consciousness is not arbitrary. It reflects something fundamental about how the human mind works. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We cannot tolerate pure chaos, pure randomness. When we encounter events, we immediately begin to organize them, to see connections, to construct meanings. The story is the primary tool we use for this organization. A story says, these events are connected. They form a pattern. They mean something. The world is not chaos, but cosmos. Not random, but meaningful. Mythology, in Campbell's vision, is the collective storytelling of humanity, the repository of the stories we have told ourselves about the largest questions. Where did the world come from? What are we? Why is there suffering and death? What is the good life? What happens after death? Is there purpose and meaning, or only blind mechanism? For millennia, these questions were answered through myth, through sacred narratives that were not scientific hypotheses, but symbolic expressions of lived wisdom. The modern world, with its scientific method and secular mindset, has largely abandoned mythology as a way of answering these questions. We seek answers in data, in empirical research, in logical analysis, and this approach has been extraordinarily successful in many domains. We understand the physical universe in ways that would astound our ancestors. We can cure diseases, travel to space, communicate instantly across the globe. The scientific method has proven its worth. Yet something has been lost. Science can tell us how things work, but not why they matter. It can describe the mechanisms of the universe, but not provide meaning. It can extend life, but not tell us how to live. The questions that myths addressed, questions of value, purpose, meaning, cannot be answered by empirical research. They belong to a different order of reality, one that requires symbolic language, poetic truth, narrative understanding. This is the gap that Campbell sought to bridge. He wanted to restore mythology to its proper place, not as a rival to science, but as a complement to it. Science addresses one set of questions, mythology, another. We need both. We need to know the facts about the physical world, and we need stories that give our lives meaning. Campbell's project was to show that myths, properly understood, remain relevant, that they speak to perennial human needs that modernity has not abolished. But what exactly are these needs? Why do we need myths? Campbell's answer, drawing on Jung, was that myths are expressions of the psyche's own structure and processes. The archetypal patterns that appear in myths, the hero, the shadow, the wise guide, the transformative journey, are not arbitrary cultural constructions, but reflections of how consciousness develops and individuates. When we hear or read a myth that resonates deeply, we are recognizing our own psychological processes mirrored in the narrative. The myth shows us the pattern of our own becoming. This is why the hero's journey has such power. It is not just a story structure invented by creative storytellers. It is a map of the transformation that every psyche must undergo in the process of becoming whole. The ordinary world represents the limited ego consciousness we start with. The call to adventure represents the promptings of the unconscious, the sense that there is more to life than what we have known. The refusal of the call represents the ego's fear of change and dissolution. The crossing of the threshold represents the decision to engage with the unconscious, to open ourselves to transformation. The trials and ordeals represent the confrontation with shadow material, with the parts of ourselves we have denied or repressed. The ultimate boon represents the integration of these contents, the achievement of a more complete self. When we hear a story that follows this pattern, something in us recognizes it, says, yes, this is true, this is how it is. The myth validates our own experience, assures us that others have walked this path, that the journey we are on is not arbitrary but archetypal, not personal but universal. There is profound comfort in this recognition, a sense that we are not alone, that our struggles and transformations participate in patterns older than civilization. Yet we might ask, is this Jungian psychological interpretation really adequate? Are myths nothing more than projections of psychological processes? Campbell himself sometimes seemed to suggest as much, treating gods and spirits as symbols of inner experiences, the other world as the unconscious, mythic events as metaphors for psychological states. But is this reduction justified? Does it not diminish the myths themselves, turning them into illustrations of a particular psychological theory? Here we encounter one of the perennial tensions in the study of mythology. Are myths about the psyche, or are they about realities beyond the psyche? When a shaman journeys to the spirit world, is this a psychological event, an exploration of the unconscious, or a genuine encounter with non-physical entities? When a mystic experiences union with the divine, is this the ego dissolving into the self, or is it actual contact with a transcendent reality? The psychological interpretation says the former. The traditional religious interpretation says the latter. Campbell's position on this question was nuanced and sometimes ambiguous. On one hand, he was clearly committed to the psychological interpretation, seeing myths as symbolic expressions of inner experience. On the other hand, he often spoke in ways that suggested he took the spiritual dimension seriously, not merely as psychology, but as ontology. He talked about the transcendent, about the mystery that surpasses understanding, about the divine ground of being. He was drawn to Eastern philosophy, which speaks of Brahman or the void or the Tao as ultimate realities beyond the phenomenal world. Perhaps the most honest answer is that myths operate on multiple levels simultaneously. They are psychological maps, and they are spiritual cosmologies, and they are social charters, and they are works of art. To reduce them to any single dimension is to miss their richness. When we engage deeply with a myth, we may experience it as revealing psychological truths, and as pointing to transcendent realities, and as evoking aesthetic responses, all at once. The myth works on us in multiple ways, speaks to multiple aspects of our being. This multidimensional quality of mythology is part of what makes it so different from scientific or philosophical discourse. A scientific paper aims for clarity, precision, univocal meaning. It says one thing and means that thing. A myth, by contrast, is intentionally ambiguous, multivalent, open to interpretation. It does not pin down a single meaning, but opens a space for meaning to arise. Different people, or the same person at different times, may hear different truths in the same myth. The myth does not tell us what to think, but invites us to think, to feel, to imagine, to enter into the story and find our own meaning there. This is why myths have staying power across centuries and millennia. They remain relevant because they are not tied to specific historical circumstances or particular propositions. They speak in the language of symbol and metaphor, which transcends time and place. The hero's journey meant something to a Bronze Age Greek and means something different, but equally profound to a 21st century American, because the pattern is flexible enough to accommodate different contexts while remaining recognizably the same. Campbell's gift was his ability to see these patterns across diverse traditions, to recognize that the same essential structures appeared in vastly different cultural expressions. A Native American vision quest, and a Christian pilgrim's progress, and a Japanese samurai's quest, and an Australian Aboriginal walkabout, are all, in Campbell's view, variations on a hero's journey. They differ in details, the landscape, the specific challenges, the cultural values embedded in the narrative, but they share a common structure: separation from the ordinary, initiation through ordeal, return with transformation. This recognition of commonality had profound implications. It suggested that beneath the surface divisions of culture, religion, and ethnicity, humans share fundamental experiences and concerns. We all face the challenge of growing up, of leaving the security of childhood and venturing into the adult world. We all encounter suffering, loss, failure, and must find ways to transform these into meaning rather than being destroyed by them. We all search for identity, for purpose, for connection with something larger than ourselves. The myths of different cultures, while expressing these universals in culturally specific ways, are addressing the same essential human condition. This universalism was both Campbell's great strength and a source of criticism. The strength was that it fostered a kind of global consciousness, a recognition of our common humanity, a perspective that could transcend provincial loyalties and see the world's traditions as a single human heritage. At a time when the world was growing smaller, when diverse cultures were coming into increasing contact, Campbell's vision offered a way to appreciate difference while recognizing unity. He suggested that we could learn from any tradition, that the myths of distant peoples in ancient times had something to teach us today, that wisdom was not the monopoly of any single culture or era. The criticism was that this universalism could be reductive, flattening important differences, imposing Western categories onto non-Western material, assuming a sameness that might not actually exist. Different cultures do not just express the same ideas in different words. They may have genuinely different worldviews, different ways of organizing reality, different values and concerns. To claim that all myths are saying the same thing might be to miss what makes each tradition unique and valuable in its own right. This debate cannot be easily resolved, because it touches on fundamental questions about universalism and relativism, about whether there are universal human truths or only culturally specific ones. Campbell clearly believed in universals, in patterns and structures that transcend cultural particularity. His critics often emphasize difference and context, arguing that meaning is always situated, always shaped by specific social and historical conditions. Both perspectives have truth to them. There are universal aspects of human experience. We all are born, grow, suffer, seek meaning, and die. And these universals are reflected in recurring mythic patterns. But there are also profound differences in how cultures understand and respond to these universals, differences that matter and should not be erased in the name of some abstract unity. The challenge is to hold both the universal and the particular in tension, to see the common patterns while respecting the unique expressions. Campbell himself seemed to understand this, at least implicitly. His work was not simply an exercise in abstract pattern recognition, but also a celebration of the rich diversity of human imagination. He delighted in the specific details of different traditions, in the wild creativity with which humans have spun narratives and populated their cosmologies with diverse beings. He told stories from many cultures with evident appreciation for their particularity, not just as examples of abstract patterns, but as valuable in themselves. One of the most moving aspects of Campbell's work is his reverence for the mythological imagination. He approached myths not with the detached objectivity of a scientist dissecting a specimen, but with the awe of someone who recognized that he was in the presence of something sacred. These stories, he understood, were not merely data points for his theories, but living expressions of the human spirit at its most creative and profound. People had lived by these stories, had found in them courage and hope, had undergone transformations through ritual enactments of them, had passed them down through generations because they mattered. Campbell often spoke of the rapture of being alive, of the fundamental mystery and wonder of existence. He criticized Western culture, particularly in its modern secular form, for losing touch with the sense of wonder, for treating the universe as a mere mechanism, life as a problem to be solved rather than a mystery to be lived. He saw mythology as a way back to wonder, as a reminder that the world is not exhausted by our rational categories, that there are dimensions of reality that science does not address, that the ordinary world is shot through with the extraordinary, if we learn to see it. This almost mystical dimension of Campbell's thought is sometimes overlooked in discussions that focus on the hero's journey as a story structure or as a psychological map. But it was central to his vision. He believed that the ultimate function of mythology was not merely to help us understand ourselves, but to align us with something larger than ourselves, with nature, with the cosmos, with the divine ground of being. Myths, he said, are the song of the universe, a way of attuning ourselves to the fundamental rhythms of existence. This idea of alignment or attunement is important. Traditional cultures did not merely tell myths. They lived them through ritual and ceremony. A ritual is a way of participating in mythic reality, of stepping out of ordinary time into sacred time, of enacting the cosmic patterns in one's own body and community. Through ritual, the individual connects with the ancestors, with the gods, with the natural cycles, with the community past and present. The ritual makes the myth real, not as historical fact, but as present experience. Campbell believed that modern Western culture, having largely abandoned ritual, had lost this dimension of experience. We live in profane time, cut off from the sacred, treating days as mere succession rather than as participation in cosmic cycles. We have holidays, but they are often mere days off, empty of deeper significance. We have ceremonies, graduations, weddings, funerals, but they often feel hollow, drained of genuine symbolic power. We go through the motions, but do not feel ourselves to be participating in anything larger than ourselves. This loss of ritual and sacred time, Campbell argued, contributes to the sense of meaninglessness that haunts modernity. Without ritual, without sacred time, life becomes flat, one-dimensional. There is only the constant pressure of tasks and obligations, the endless succession of ordinary moments, nothing that breaks through to a deeper level, nothing that says, this matters in a way that transcends the everyday. Campbell's work can be seen as an attempt to restore some of what has been lost, to reintroduce people to the symbolic dimension of existence, to teach a kind of literacy that allows one to read the mythological language that is still being spoken, if only we have ears to hear. His message was that the myths have not died. We have simply forgotten how to hear them, how to see the mythological dimension in our own lives and in the world around us. This brings us to one of Campbell's most profound insights, that the hero's journey is not just something that happened in ancient times or in distant cultures, but is happening now, in every life, potentially. Each of us is called to our own adventure, our own journey of transformation. The call might come as a crisis, or as a deep dissatisfaction with life we are living, or as a dream or vision or encounter that disrupts our comfortable assumptions. We can refuse the call, can cling to the familiar, can remain in the ordinary world where everything is known and safe. Or we can accept, can cross the threshold, can venture into the unknown. If we accept, we enter a realm where we will be tested, where we will face aspects of ourselves that we have avoided, where the comfortable illusions we have maintained will be stripped away. This is not pleasant. The hero's journey is not a pleasure cruise, but an ordeal. There's the dark night of the soul, the moment in the belly of the whale when all seems lost. But if we persist, if we do not turn back, there is the possibility of transformation, of finding treasures we did not know existed, of becoming more than we were. And then the return, which is perhaps the most challenging part. We cannot remain in the realm of transformation. We must come back to ordinary life, bringing what we have learned with us. We must find ways to integrate the extraordinary insights of the journey into the everyday world of jobs and relationships and mundane responsibilities. This is the true test of the journey, not just having the peak experience, but being changed by it in ways that endure, in ways that allow us to live differently. Campbell's biography, as we have seen, exemplified this pattern. He heard the call in childhood and pursued it despite uncertainty and hardship. He withdrew from conventional paths to undertake his own intensive education. He faced the ordeal of isolation and economic insecurity. He found his boon in the insights about mythology that became his life's work. And he returned, teaching and writing and speaking, bringing his insights to others, helping them to see the mythological dimension of their own lives. But Campbell would insist that his story is not unique or special. Every life is a potential hero's journey. The call comes to all of us, in one form or another. The question is whether we will hear it and whether we will have the courage to respond. Most people, Campbell sadly observed, refuse the call, remain in the ordinary world, live lives of quiet desperation, never venturing into the unknown, never discovering what they might become. They remain stuck, unfulfilled, dimly aware that something is missing but unwilling to risk what would be required to find it. This might sound harsh, even judgmental, but Campbell was not condemning those who refused the call. He understood that the call can be terrifying, that the journey requires real courage, that not everyone is in a position to undertake it. Life circumstances, social constraints, psychological limitations, all of these can make the journey difficult or impossible. Campbell's call to adventure was not meant to be a source of guilt for those who cannot respond, but an invitation to those who can, a reminder that the possibility exists. Moreover, the hero's journey can take many forms, some of them quite modest and unspectacular. It need not be a dramatic external adventure. It might be the journey of recovery from addiction, facing the demons within, and emerging sober and whole. It might be the journey of mourning, descending into grief after a loss, and eventually returning with a deeper appreciation for life. It might be the journey of therapy, exploring the wounds of childhood, and emerging with greater self-understanding and compassion. It might be the journey of spiritual practice, sitting in meditation day after day, confronting the restless mind, and gradually finding stillness and clarity. The pattern is the same, whether the journey is external or internal, dramatic or quiet. There is the call, the threshold, the trials, the transformation, the return. The specifics vary infinitely, but the structure remains recognizable. And recognizing this structure can be helpful, can provide a sense of orientation when one is in the midst of chaos, assure one that what feels like meaningless suffering might actually be a necessary part of a transformative process. This is one of the therapeutic applications of Campbell's work, providing a narrative framework that makes sense of suffering and transformation. When a client in therapy is going through a difficult time, feeling lost and confused, it can be powerful to say, "You are in the belly of the whale. You are in the dark part of the journey. This is hard, but it is not meaningless. This is where transformation happens. Such reframing does not eliminate the difficulty, but it can make it more bearable by giving it meaning and context. Yet we must be careful not to romanticize suffering or to suggest that all pain leads to growth. Not all suffering is transformative. Some suffering is simply destructive, leaving people broken rather than strengthened. The hero's journey is an idealized pattern, a map of how transformation can happen, not a guarantee that it will happen. Real life is messier, more ambiguous, less neatly structured than myth. This gap between mythic pattern and lived reality is important to acknowledge. Campbell has sometimes been criticized for presenting the hero's journey as a template that all lives should follow, creating expectations that can be oppressive when life does not conform. If your suffering does not lead to transformation, if you do not emerge from the ordeal with a boon, does that mean you have failed? If your life does not follow the heroic pattern, does that mean your life lacks meaning? These are real concerns. The danger of any powerful narrative framework is that it can become prescriptive, can impose a structure that might not fit, can create standards against which people judge themselves and feel inadequate. Campbell's intent was not to impose but to illuminate, not to prescribe but to describe, not to create obligations but to reveal possibilities. But intent and reception do not always align. A more generous reading of Campbell's project would see him as offering the hero's journey, not as a mandatory path, but as one possible way of understanding experience, a framework that some people, in some situations, might find helpful. It is a tool, not a dogma. If it illuminates your experience, use it. If it does not fit, set it aside. The map is not the territory, and no single map can capture all possible territories. This points to a broader question about the role of myth in modern life. Campbell believed that we need myths, that they serve essential psychological and spiritual functions. But what does it mean to have a myth in the modern world? We cannot simply return to the myths of traditional cultures, cannot believe in Zeus or Thor or Quetzalcoatl the way ancient peoples did. We know too much, have seen too much, have a critical consciousness that cannot be undone. We cannot achieve a naive belief in mythological narratives as literal truths. Campbell's answer was that we do not need to believe in myths literally. We need to understand them symbolically. We need to recognize that myths are not claims about historical or scientific facts, but expressions of psychological and spiritual truths. We need to develop what he called symbolic literacy, the ability to read the symbolic language in which myths speak. With this literacy, we can engage with any myth from any tradition, finding in it insights and inspiration, without needing to accept its literal claims. This approach has merit, but it also has limitations. Can a myth retain its power when it is understood only symbolically? For traditional peoples, myths were not symbols but realities. The gods were real beings, not psychological archetypes. The mythic events happened in a sacred time that was more real than ordinary time. The rituals connected one with actual spiritual forces, not merely with psychological contents. This belief, this literalism, gave myths their power, their ability to transform consciousness and shape behavior. When we bracket the literal and focus on the symbolic, do we not lose something essential? Does the myth become a kind of metaphor, interesting and evocative perhaps, but lacking the full power it had when it was believed in fully? Campbell was aware of this problem but did not really solve it. He wanted to preserve the power of myth while acknowledging its symbolic nature, but it is not clear that this is fully possible. Something may be inevitably lost in translation from literal to symbolic reading. Yet perhaps this loss is the price of modernity, a trade-off we must accept. We gain critical consciousness, scientific knowledge, freedom from superstition, but we lose the immediacy and power of mythological belief. We cannot have it both ways, cannot simultaneously believe and disbelieve, cannot be both naive and sophisticated. We must choose, and Campbell chose sophistication, the symbolic, psychological reading, hoping that it could preserve what mattered most in myth, even as it acknowledged that the literal level was no longer tenable. There is a melancholy in this, a sense of loss that pervades much of Campbell's work even as he celebrates the world's mythologies. He knew that something had been lost in the transition from traditional to modern consciousness, knew that the world of our ancestors, for all its limitations, had a wholeness and integration that the modern world lacks. He spoke often of the wasteland, T.S. Eliot's image for the spiritual aridity of modernity, the sense that the land is barren, the king is wounded, the sacred center no longer holds. Yet Campbell was not simply nostalgic. He did not advocate a return to the past, did not imagine that we could or should go back to pre-modern consciousness. His project was forward-looking, to find ways to restore meaning and mythological consciousness in the context of modernity, to create what he called creative mythology, a mythology adequate to contemporary life. This would not be a collectively imposed system, but a personally discovered one, drawing on the resources of world mythology to construct meaningful narratives for individual lives. This vision of creative mythology is both inspiring and problematic. It is inspiring because it suggests that we are not doomed to meaninglessness, that the mythological impulse still lives, that we can find or create narratives that make sense of our lives. It is democratic, suggesting that everyone can be a mythmaker, that you do not need priests or scriptures or institutional authority to find meaning. You can draw on any tradition, any story, any symbol that speaks to you, and construct your own synthesis. But it is also problematic because it is so individualistic. Traditional mythology was collective, shared by a community, serving to bind people together in common beliefs and practices. Creative mythology, as Campbell describes it, is individual, each person constructing their own meaning. This can lead to a kind of fragmentation, where there is no shared mythological language, no common symbols, no collective rituals. Everyone has their own personal mythology, but there is no cultural mythology binding the community together. Is this sustainable? Can a society function without shared myths? Campbell seemed to think so, or at least to think that this was the direction history was moving and we must make the best of it. But others have questioned whether a completely individualized mythology can fulfill all the functions that traditional mythology served. A myth is not just a personal story. It is a social glue, a way of creating cohesion and shared identity. When everyone has their own personal mythology, what holds the society together? These are questions without easy answers, and they point to ongoing tensions in modern life. We value individual freedom and autonomy, yet we also long for community and shared meaning. We celebrate diversity and pluralism, yet we also sense the need for some common ground. Campbell's vision of creative mythology reflects these tensions without fully resolving them. Perhaps the resolution, if there is one, lies not in returning to a single dominant mythology, but in developing what we might call a mythology of mythologies, a meta-narrative that honors diversity while recognizing commonalities. This is, in a sense, what Campbell was trying to create with his hero's journey framework. He was saying, there are many different stories, but they all reflect certain patterns, certain universal human experiences. We can honor each tradition in its uniqueness while seeing that they are all expressions of a shared humanity. This pluralistic vision has appeal, especially in our globalized world where people from different traditions live side by side. It suggests that we do not have to choose between our tradition and others, do not have to insist that ours is right and theirs is wrong. We can learn from all traditions, seeing each as offering valuable insights while recognizing that they are all partial perspectives on the infinite mystery of existence. Yet pluralism has its own challenges. If all myths are equally valid, do any of them have genuine authority? If every tradition is just one perspective among many, why commit to any particular one? Does pluralism lead to a kind of relativism where nothing is really true, where everything is just opinion? These questions trouble those who seek not just perspective but truth, who want to know not just how different cultures have imagined the divine, but whether the divine is real. Campbell's answer, influenced by Vedantic philosophy, was that behind the diversity of forms lies a unity, that all myths are pointing toward the same ultimate reality, that the gods of different traditions are different masks of God, different faces of the transcendent. This is a beautiful vision, appealing in its inclusivity and its promise of ultimate unity. But it is, also, arguably, a particular perspective, one shaped by Eastern non-dualism, and not necessarily accepted by all traditions. Monotheistic traditions, for instance, often insist on the uniqueness of their revelation, on the idea that there are true and false claims about the divine, that all paths do not lead to the same place. These theological and philosophical debates are profound and unresolvable within the scope of Campbell's work or anyone's work. What is clear is that Campbell provided a framework that many people have found helpful for navigating religious diversity, for engaging with multiple traditions without feeling that they must choose only one, for seeing the world's mythologies as a collective human heritage rather than as competing claims to truth. As we near the end of our journey through Campbell's life and work, let us reflect on his legacy, on what he has left us, on how his vision might guide us as we face the challenges of our own time. Campbell lived through most of the 20th century, witnessing 2 world wars, the nuclear age, the space age, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the environmental crisis, the digital revolution. He saw modernity in its full complexity, with its technological marvels and its spiritual poverty, its liberation from old constraints and its creation of new problems. Through all of this, he held to his conviction that mythology mattered, that the old stories still had something to say, that the mythological dimension of existence could not be eliminated by science or secularism. In an age of specialists, Campbell was a generalist, ranging across disciplines and traditions, making connections that specialists often missed. In an age of cynicism, he maintained a sense of wonder and reverence. In an age of materialism, he insisted on the reality of the spiritual dimension. In an age of fragmentation, he sought wholeness and integration. These qualities made him a kind of prophet, a voice calling the culture back to what had been forgotten or dismissed. His most enduring contribution is probably the hero's journey framework, which has shaped storytelling across multiple media and given countless individuals a way to understand their own life journeys. Whether one accepts all of Campbell's claims about universalism and archetypes or not, the hero's journey remains a powerful narrative pattern, one that clearly resonates with something deep in human psychology. It has helped writers to structure their stories, therapists to help clients through transitions, and ordinary people to make sense of their struggles and transformations. Beyond the specific framework, Campbell's broader legacy is his insistence that mythology is not dead, that the symbolic imagination remains vital, that we need stories and rituals and sacred narratives to live fully human lives. He challenged the reductionism of both scientific materialism, which sees only matter and mechanism, and religious fundamentalism, which insists on literal belief. He offered a third way, a symbolic, psychological, spiritual reading of myths that honors both empirical truth and meaningful experience. Campbell also helped to democratize mythology, taking it out of the exclusive hands of scholars and priests and saying that these stories belong to everyone. He taught that you can learn from any tradition, that wisdom is not the monopoly of any culture or era, that the world's mythologies are a treasure trove available to all who seek meaning. This openness, this inclusivity, has its critics, as we have seen, but it also has great value, especially in a pluralistic world where encounter with diverse traditions is inevitable. Perhaps most importantly, Campbell lived his own teaching. He followed his bliss, pursuing his passion for mythology despite practical obstacles. He undertook his own hero's journey, withdrawing from conventional paths to seek wisdom in isolation, then returning to share what he had found. His life became a testament to his ideas, showing that it is possible to live meaningfully in the modern world, to find one's calling and to follow it, to make a contribution that outlasts oneself. Yet Campbell's work also leaves questions unanswered, tensions unresolved. The relationship between universalism and cultural specificity, between psychological interpretation and spiritual reality, between individual meaning and collective mythology. These remain open questions that each generation must address in its own way. Campbell's answers, shaped by his time and temperament, may not be adequate for all circumstances, but the questions he asked remain urgent, and his work provides a starting point for our own explorations. As we look ahead, we might ask, what would Campbell say about our current moment? We live in a time of extraordinary technological change, of ecological crisis, of political polarization, of pandemic and uncertainty. The old order seems to be breaking down, and what will replace it is unclear. Mythologically speaking, we are in a liminal time, a time between worlds, when the old myths no longer function, but new myths have not yet emerged. Campbell will likely see this as both danger and opportunity. Danger because times of transition are chaotic and destructive, because people cling desperately to dying myths or embrace dangerous new ones, because without clear mythological guidance, societies can lose their way. But also opportunity, because in the breakdown of old forms, there is the possibility for genuine renewal, for creative mythology to emerge, for new stories to arise that address contemporary challenges in ways the old myths cannot. He would probably emphasize the need for what he called a planetary mythology, a mythological vision adequate to our interconnected world. Traditional mythologies were tribal or national, defining insiders and outsiders, our gods and their gods, our people, and the others. Such mythologies are inadequate and dangerous in a globalized world where our survival depends on cooperation. We need stories that recognize our common humanity, that see the earth as a single system, that honor diversity while acknowledging fundamental unity. Campbell saw the image of the earth from space, that blue marble photographed by the Apollo astronauts, as a potential mythological image for our time. For the first time in history, we could see our planet as a whole, a single living system floating in the void. This image, he suggested, could function mythologically, reshaping our consciousness from tribal to planetary, helping us to recognize that we are all crew members on Spaceship Earth, that the old divisions of nation, race, and religion are superficial compared to our common identity as Earthlings. This vision remains relevant, perhaps even more so than in Campbell's time. Climate change, pandemics, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, these are planetary challenges that cannot be addressed by any single nation or tradition. They require global cooperation, a shared sense of planetary identity, a mythology that could foster such identity, that could make us feel viscerally our belonging to the earth and to the human family, might be essential to our survival. But creating such a mythology is no easy task. Mythologies cannot be invented by committee or imposed from above. They arise organically from the lived experience of communities, from artists and storytellers and religious visionaries who give form to what is emerging in the collective consciousness. Campbell pointed toward the need for planetary mythology, but he could not create it himself. That task falls to us, to the artists and storytellers and thinkers of our time, working with the materials of tradition but creating something new. Campbell would also likely emphasize the continuing importance of the individual hero's journey in our time. Whatever collective challenges we face, each person still must undertake their own path of transformation, must answer their own call to adventure, must confront their own shadows and find their own truth. The individual journey and the collective transformation are intertwined. A society is only as healthy as its individuals, and individuals are shaped by their cultural context. We need both personal and collective renewal, both individual heroes undertaking their journeys and new mythologies emerging to guide the community. In our current moment of crisis and transition, Campbell's message is that we should not despair, should not give in to cynicism or nihilism, should not abandon the search for meaning. The mythological dimension of existence remains, even when traditional forms have lost their power. The call to adventure still sounds for those who have ears to hear. The journey toward wholeness is still possible, still necessary, still the path that gives life meaning. As we conclude our exploration of Joseph Campbell's life and work, let us rest in the quiet, knowing that the stories we tell ourselves shape the lives we live. Myths are not mere entertainment or ancient curiosities, but maps of the soul, guides for the journey toward becoming fully human. Campbell devoted his life to preserving and interpreting these maps, to making them available to modern seekers, to showing that the old wisdom remains relevant even in a radically changed world. His great insight was simple but profound. The same story is being told over and over, in countless variations, across all cultures and eras. It is the story of the hero who ventures forth, faces trials, dies, and is reborn, and returns with gifts for the community. It is your story and my story, the story of every person who dares to leave the safety of the known and venture into the mystery of the unknown. It is the story of consciousness itself, the eternal journey from ignorance to wisdom, from fragmentation to wholeness, from the limited ego to the larger self. Campbell taught us to recognize this story in all its manifestations, to see the hero's journey in ancient myths and modern films, in religious scriptures and personal dreams, in the lives of saints, and in our own struggles and transformations. He taught us that we are not alone, that others have walked this path before us, that the journey, however difficult, is worthwhile, that transformation is possible, that the boon we seek is real and attainable. He taught us to follow our bliss, to listen to the deep call of our own being, to have the courage to be who we truly are rather than who others expect us to be. He taught us that mythology is not dead but sleeping, waiting for us to remember the language in which it speaks. He taught us that the world is alive with meaning if we have eyes to see and ears to hear, that the sacred has not withdrawn from the earth but remains present, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered by those who seek it. Joseph Campbell was a mythologist, a teacher, a scholar, a storyteller, a seeker. He was a hero who answered a call in childhood, who undertook his journey through the wilderness of intensive study, who found his treasure in the patterns that unite world mythology, and who returned to spend his life sharing that treasure with others. His journey is complete, but his work continues, living on in his books, in his students and readers, in the countless people who have been moved and inspired by his vision. As we let him rest, as we let his story settle into memory, we might ask ourselves, what is our call to adventure? What threshold are we being invited to cross? What ordeals await us on the path of transformation? What boon might we find and bring back to share? These are the questions that Campbell's work invites us to ponder, not as abstract theoretical exercises, but as urgent personal inquiries that shape how we live. The hero's journey is not just a story structure or a psychological map. It is an invitation, a challenge, a call echoing through the ages. It asks, will you venture forth? Will you face the unknown? Will you be transformed? The journey is dangerous, uncertain, demanding. But the alternative is worse. A life half lived, a self half known, a potential unfulfilled. Campbell's legacy is the reminder that we are all called to this journey, that we all have a story to live, that we all can become heroes of our own lives if we have the courage to answer the call. And so we come to the end of our exploration, this long meditation on Joseph Campbell and the mythological dimension of human existence. The night is deep now, and the words begin to blur into the softness of sleep. Let Campbell's vision of the hero's journey accompany you into your dreams, where mythological symbols still speak in their original language, where the archetypes still walk, where transformation still happens in the deep places of the psyche. May you find your call. May you cross your threshold. May you face your ordeals with courage. May you find your boon. May you return to share what you have discovered. May you live your life as the adventure it is, the story that only you can tell, the hero's journey that is uniquely yours. Rest now, wanderer. The quest continues tomorrow, as it always does, as it always will, for as long as there are humans to venture forth, to seek, to transform, to return. The hero with 1,000 faces wears your face tonight. The ancient pattern lives in you. The mythological dimension awaits your discovery. Sleep well, and dream of dragons and treasures, of thresholds and transformations, of the eternal journey toward becoming who you truly are. The stories are endless, but for tonight, this story is complete. Until we meet again in the realm between dreaming and remembering, until the next journey begins, rest in the knowing that you are part of a story much larger than yourself, a story that has been unfolding since the first humans looked at the stars and wondered, a story that will continue as long as consciousness seeks meaning, as long as the mythological imagination creates, as long as heroes answer the call and venture forth into the beautiful, terrible, transforming mystery of being alive. Good night, seeker. Good night, hero. Good night, wanderer of the waking world. May your dreams be mythological, your sleep be deep, and your journey, when morning comes, lead you toward your bliss. Joseph Campbell has shared his treasure. Now go forth and find your own. The adventure awaits.